Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about worker democracy, which is one of the more popular economic ideas to come out of the left over the past couple of decades. One of the most common criticisms of our existing economic system is that people have to work in jobs under authoritarian conditions in order to access resources and social standing. Modern workplaces are internally hierarchical, so people work for bosses and managers who are not directly accountable to them. The degree of monitoring and control exerted by bosses in the workplace would not be considered acceptable if done by governments. These jobs usually entail tedious, repetitive work which can take its toll on our bodies and minds. At-will employment means employees do not have a direct say in hiring and firing decisions, despite the huge impact these things have on their lives.
The doors are locked. JLB Credit UK is no longer existent. Thank you, and good night, England.
Managers and owners may make decisions regarding pay which favour themselves rather than workers, or even the organisation as a whole. Giving workers democratic control of workplaces is one common-sense solution to these imbalances of power and wealth. If the workplace is governed tyrannically, then why not undo the tyranny directly so workers can collectively make decisions about how a firm is run? This could help to ameliorate these issues by making bosses elected and accountable to the workers. Presumably, if workers have more of a say in how things are done, they will tend not to choose workplace policies which endanger their health, happiness, or livelihoods. Well, one answer to why not worker democracy is that while it's a nice idea, it just doesn't work out in practice, and that's what we're going to explore in this video. Can worker-owned firms run as well as conventional firms? Do they actually produce benefits for workers and for society? Are there examples of policies and approaches which can expand the practice effectively? We'll investigate these questions systematically, looking at the ideas and theories behind worker democracy, what it really looks like in practice, and the evidence on its benefits and drawbacks. I've had enough of critiquing people, to be honest, so let's get some positive leftist ideas going. This video is also going to feature some great animations from Friberg, who kindly agreed to help. Hopefully they'll aid in explaining a tricky topic and make the videos more visually interesting than usual. We'll start with a little bit more on what exactly worker democracy means. At its core, worker democracy is a simple idea. Our dominant model of capitalism sees firms separating ownership, control, and workers. Investors who have put money into a firm own it, so they are able to decide who runs it and is therefore in charge of the workers. There are variations of this basic rule. In some cases, the majority owner will still be the founding entrepreneur or their family, and they may also run the firm. But often, there will be several layers of hierarchy between the owners and the workers. Instead of hiring a manager directly, investors elect a board who, in turn, hire the manager. In one way or another, worker democracy collapses these distinctions between ownership, control, and workers. Workers own the firm and have some say in how it's run, directly making decisions, electing bosses, or some combination of the two. The idea dates back at least as far as the 18th century, but has become more popular in recent years. Although putting workers in charge is simple in theory, in practice there are quite a few ways an organisation can be worker-owned and run. You can think of worker democracy as an umbrella term which encompasses a few similar but distinct forms of organisation. So-called worker cooperatives are the clearest realisation of the principle of worker democracy, since they operate on a one-member, one-vote principle for the workers. But even this is an umbrella term, since levels of ownership and control can still vary within worker co-ops. Some are 100% worker-owned, while others have majority worker representation but still have traditional shareholders. As we'll see, worker co-ops also vary in the rights their members have over the profits and decisions of the company, with different countries settling on different rules. Distinct from worker co-ops, there are also businesses where workers own shares and therefore part of the company. Giving workers shares and allowing them to participate in the running of the organisation can become another form of worker democracy. However, in some cases, share ownership does not entail decision-making power, and shares may even be out of reach of the workers, which is just ownership rather than democracy. Finally, workers in large corporations are sometimes allowed to elect representatives to the board. This may entail less direct input from workers, but still grants them a say in the running of the organisation through elections, so we'll count it as a form of worker democracy too. Because of these distinctions, it's too simplistic just to say worker democracy works or doesn't work. There are different forms and they produce different outcomes depending on the context. It's a complicated topic, but in this video we'll spend plenty of time teasing out these distinctions. I'm going to look at a variety of studies which touch on all types of worker democracy that we've mentioned. But first, let's take a look at the general picture. A preliminary assessment of the literature illustrates a number of benefits of worker democracy when compared to conventional capitalist enterprises. Less inequality within firms. Workers are less likely to leave voluntarily. Workers are less likely to leave involuntarily. Workers put in more effort. Workers report increased trust levels. Lower rates of business failure or higher rates of survival. Similar levels of productivity to capitalist firms. Similar levels of investment to capitalist firms. You may have noticed that I haven't claimed firms with worker democracy pay more on average than conventional firms. That's because the evidence on this is inconsistent, with some studies finding they do pay more, others finding they don't pay more, and others still finding pay is equal between them. We'll return to why this is later. All in all, the evidence sounds pretty great, but as you might have suspected from the length of this video, which I promised would be short, we aren't going to stop here. The evidence on worker democracy is a bit of a minefield, and I frequently see people make mistakes. To take one example, people often assume that all organisations known as cooperatives are worker cooperatives, but cooperative is actually another umbrella term. You see, cooperatives are just groups of people cooperating. Please subscribe to my Patreon for more insights like this. The cooperation can be between workers, but it can also be between other groups or organisations. Consumer co-ops exist, where consumers have a stake in the business and can participate in its decision-making. Credit unions are a good example of a consumer co-op, as the customers own the bank and can elect its directors, as well as being entitled to a share of its profits. Traditional businesses and farmers also often form assembly groups, which are often referred to as co-ops. However, the businesses themselves are not internally democratic. They just group together like a kind of congress for businesses to increase their resilience and market power. Many of the studies you'll see, including some of those I summarised earlier, are of co-ops in general, not just worker co-ops, so watch out for this when you're looking into the topic. For example, when researching for this video, I used a helpful document compiled by Rose Rist, which summarised quite a few papers about co-ops. Although I'd recommend the document to anyone interested in the topic, I found that in a few cases, Rose had not distinguished between the different types of co-op. I messaged him privately suggesting that he could clarify this, and he said, "Yup, that makes sense. I'll revisit my definitions to make the document more accurate." That's the whole story. This is just how adults communicate with each other. Take note, YouTube. Worker co-ops are actually in the minority of co-ops. It has been estimated that there are a total of 800 million people in co-ops across the world, but that only 100 million of these are in worker co-ops. In any case, from now on I will largely focus on worker-owned and run firms. So if I use co-op, it means worker co-op unless specified otherwise. I'm also going to use terms like firm, enterprise, business, company, and even organisation interchangeably. I'll use capitalist and conventional firm interchangeably too. The most important thing to remember is that the main point of contrast in this video is between organisations which are run based on capitalist principles and those which have at least some degree of worker ownership and control. This is what I call worker democracy. Throughout the video, we're going to accrue policies which will expand worker democracy in sensible and pragmatic ways. To help keep track of this, we'll be putting them in the policy bag as they come up and summarising all of them at the end to remind ourselves. Now, I want to ask a simple question. What benefits and drawbacks do we think worker democracy could have, and why? Early theories of worker co-ops argued that they would be more prone to failure because the lack of leadership and clear profit motive would produce underinvestment, inefficiency, and opportunism as workers line their own pockets. Ultimately, worker co-ops might just degenerate into capitalist enterprises to stay profitable and overcome their own inherent limitations.
I've said it before and I'll say it again. Democracy simply doesn't work.
I'm not going to spend too much time on these theories because it's fair to say that most investigations have concluded they are wrong, or at least limited, to use the academic word for wrong. At best, they identify possible tendencies which can be easily overcome with good institutional design and with people not being morons.
Many years ago, when you used to go, look, there's a great big deep hole. Will I step in it? No, I'll just walk around it like that. Well, how'd you manage to learn to do that? Well, my parents taught me not to be a moron. And, I just kind of carried it on from there.
In fact, I would argue the only reason anyone would take these theories literally was that their brain had been poisoned by a mainstream economics education. One example is the so-called free rider problem, where workers do not put as much effort into a collectively owned enterprise because the output is shared with their colleagues, so they would only get a small proportion of the fruits of their individual labour. According to the logic of the free rider problem, rational and self-interested workers will always have an incentive to put less effort in and leech from the efforts of others. The business will unravel as people realise that they will gain the most from shirking their duties. The economist Amartya Sen once called the people depicted in these models rational fools. In the case of the free rider hypothesis, these rational fools act based on such a narrow conception of self-interest that they don't take into account the obviously damaging long-term consequences of their behaviour, both to the firm and, ultimately, to themselves. Normal, reasonable people, who are different to rational economic man, are usually happy to put efforts into a collective endeavour that will deliver benefits for them in the long run, even if that means foregoing some short-term gains. Cooperation in worker democracies can be a challenge, and a few people will try to free ride, but evidence illustrates this problem rarely becomes so bad it affects the performance of the workers and the firm. Experiments have shown that people randomly allocated to do tasks in groups where they can elect their leaders and/or choose their pay structures are more productive than those who are led by an unelected manager who makes pay choices for them. One study looked at real firms with high levels of worker ownership of shares in the company and found that workers are keener to monitor others, making them more productive than those with low or no ownership of shares and directly contradicting the free rider hypothesis. We'll discuss share ownership in more detail later on. It turns out there are potential benefits to giving workers control and a stake in the running of the organisation they work for. This allows workers to play a key role in decision making and reorient the goals of the organisation. But to understand all this a bit better, we're going to have to look at some more serious economic theory. You may have heard of the reality TV show The Undercover Boss, where the CEO of a major corporation disguises themselves as an employee and goes to work on the front lines. Having watched quite a few episodes, one thing is abundantly clear: the boss has no fucking idea what's going on in their company. One episode takes the boss of the UK delivery company DHL, which sees him working in customer service call centres, delivery driving, and moving boxes in warehouses, at which point he discovers that these things are difficult.
The pressure that's on them to make so many drops an hour is tricky. The stop-start and the country roads and corners all the way. I mean, that's quite time-consuming and it's quite demanding.
I'm a little surprised that it's so intense. Those parcels keep on coming. And you have to keep on moving them, because if you don't, you're not going to get the aircraft out on time. It's like that.
Each aircraft container can hold up to 1,000 packages and weigh as much as 3.5 tons.
Whoa. This is hard work. I'm a little surprised that it's so manual.
The boss typically develops a better understanding of the company and new sympathy for their employees along the way. It's all a bit contrived and shallow for sure, but it illustrates the importance of an idea introduced by the free market economist Friedrich Hayek, that of localized knowledge. Hayek argued that centralized authorities find it difficult to harness and coordinate local knowledge. Policies that are the same across a wide range of circumstances cannot account for the particular circumstances of time and place, which are fine-grained, constantly changing, and are therefore unknowable to any central authority. According to Hayek, markets are needed to coordinate activity among millions of individuals with different knowledge, preferences, and operating in different contexts. Centralized authorities simply do not have the ability to know what is going on in the economy and respond to it in real time, as this would require voluminous information and countless decisions to be made every minute. Although I don't fully agree with Hayek's conclusions, his diagnosis of what he called the economic problem was completely correct. Modern economies are unbelievably complex, partly owing to localized knowledge. Hayek was focused largely on how markets solve the knowledge problem, but the anarchist James Scott took his insights a little bit further. In his masterpiece Seeing Like a State, Scott uses meticulously detailed examples to show how top-down organization in general fails to capture the complexity of social and economic life.
Anyone who has worked in a formal organization, even a small one strictly governed by detailed rules, knows that handbooks and written guidelines fail utterly in explaining how the institution goes successfully about its work. Accounting for its smooth operation are nearly endless and shifting sets of implicit understandings, tacit coordinations, and practical mutualities that could never be successfully captured in a written code. This ubiquitous social fact is useful to employees and labor unions. The premise behind what are tellingly called work-to-rule strikes is a case in point. When Parisian taxi drivers want to press a point on the municipal authorities about regulations or fees, they sometimes launch a work-to-rule strike. It consists merely in following meticulously all the regulations in the Code routier and thereby bringing traffic throughout central Paris to a grinding halt. The drivers thus take tactical advantage of the fact that the circulation of traffic is possible only because drivers have mastered a set of practices that have evolved outside and often in contravention of the formal rules.
Of course, the work-to-rule strike comes from France. Whoever implements rules and plans from the top down is likely to find that in practice they don't really work out. They may look good on paper but fail when confronted with the messier reality. Or in other cases, the planning is off simply because the right workers haven't been consulted. This is actually a frequent revelation in The Undercover Boss.
Viv's been trained to follow company protocol, but Phil thinks the rules are standing in the way of good customer service.
Really nice to ring Kath up and say, did you get through to her?
No, we don't do that, Eddie, because it's not your job.
Or can we go on and see if Kath's logged?
No.
No?
No, it's not your job. Your job is to take the calls, we deal with them, and we move on.
This is Phil's worst nightmare. Cracks in the DHL system are leaving a customer still wondering where her missing parcel is.
The rumour that Telford get paid more than Stoke couriers really needs some investigation. Were I an employee in that position and I knew that there was such a difference in my salary and the guy up the road, I'd be pretty demotivated, I think.
Hayek's idea of local knowledge extends to the workplace. Those who make decisions about a traditional capitalist company's policies are different to those who follow the policies. In addition, those who manage the company are often different to those who actually own the company. There is a lack of cohesion between these groups in terms of both their knowledge and their interests. It follows that there are two main benefits of worker democracy. 1. Workers can harness their collective knowledge to make the running of the firm more effective. 2. Workers can use their political power to make sure the organisation is run with their interests at heart. Let's learn a little bit more about the evidence surrounding these benefits. 3 countries with well-established worker cooperative sectors are Italy, France, and Uruguay. Each have unique features which help them to thrive, in seeming contravention of crude economic theories. In France, there are 2,000 worker co-ops employing about 46,500 people, which is more than most countries but still well under 1% of all firms. Co-ops operate across a variety of industries but mostly in construction and manufacturing. French co-ops take large initial financial contributions from members, which helps them to finance investment. The vast majority of workers are full members, while the rest are likely to become members after their probationary period. Employees get access to at least 25% of the firm's profits, and each member gets 1 vote, no matter how much money they originally put in. French co-ops also legally have to abide by plowback rules, where they must invest a certain proportion of the profits back into the business. In theory, this helps them to avoid underinvestment, though in practice they often invest more than is required anyway. The Italian case is similar to the French case, with member contributions and plowback laws ensuring co-ops are relatively well financed. But the Italian cooperative sector is slightly larger and is concentrated in the north. Italian co-ops are exempt from corporate taxation if they save their profits, and are also required to invest 3% into umbrella organisations which aid cooperative development. This is one reason Italian co-ops seem to have the clearest social mission and are responsible for many social services in some areas. Another interesting legal feature of Italian co-ops is the Marcora law, which enables workers to use their unemployment benefits to buy out a failing business and turn it into a worker co-op. This is exactly the type of law I would like to see spread across the world, since it's difficult to argue against. If workers can rescue the business, then great. If not, the outcome is the same as it would have been in absence of the law. Moving on to Uruguay, worker co-ops are about 1% of the total. These firms are exempt from payroll taxes on their workers' income, But to qualify for this, they have to make sure at least 5 out of every 6 workers have full membership rights and are therefore able to vote on the firm's policies. This tax incentive both encourages the formation of worker co-ops and discourages any tendency for them to degenerate, employing people without giving them voting rights, an issue to which we will return later. I know we're going to return to a lot of things later, please bear with me. The policies we've seen in France, Italy, and Uruguay all encourage worker co-ops through tax advantages, legal structures that ensure they function properly, and laws which enable workers to take control of failing firms. The organisations these policies enable are the most classic form of worker democracy, with workers guaranteed majority representation. We'll therefore note these down as entry number 1 in our bag of policies. So far, we've seen that notions of worker co-ops as inherently doomed to fail are demonstrably false. But I worry that advocates of worker co-ops can be uncritical in summarising the evidence surrounding their benefits. For example, here is the channel's second thought.
Co-op members often find themselves possessing a level of dignity and quality of life unattainable by traditional employees, along with high job stability and opportunities to develop new skills. And membership is open to anyone willing to accept certain responsibilities, regardless of discrimination they may face elsewhere. On top of all this, worker co-ops can be more stable than profit-driven corporations, reliably staying afloat in times of economic turmoil, which have become worryingly common in recent years.
And here is the channel Loner Box, in what is otherwise a very critical and highly recommended video on the subject.
They are currently the fastest growing enterprise on Earth. Profit isn't their primary aim, which allows them to flex more effectively in economic downturns. They're less likely to fire workers during economic downturns. They're more effective at fostering social trust and commitment amongst workers. When companies are fully worker-owned, they're a third as likely to fail as traditional firms. Research from Canada found that co-ops had a 3-year and 5-year survival rate that exceeded the national average, and studies from Italy and Germany found that they're less likely to declare bankruptcy.
Both Second Thought and Loner Box are giving an accurate summary of the findings in the literature, which we also summarised earlier. But neither of them investigates the studies further to ask how generalisable the findings may be. Yeah, remember when I said I wouldn't be critiquing people in this video? I lied. Consider that most of the people in worker co-ops have often made a conscious choice to create or join one. This complicates things as it implies the people in these co-ops could be what economists call a selected sample. These people may just be different to the rest of the population in their goals and attitudes. This selection is underscored by a fact we just learned. Co-ops are usually a small proportion of the overall economy, accounting for a single-digit percentage of employment, even in countries where they are relatively popular. There are also industries and places with higher concentrations of worker co-ops, which makes it difficult to know whether the observed advantages and disadvantages of those co-ops just stem from their location, workforce, or industry. One Uruguayan study looked at firm survival rates and found that co-ops do have an advantage overall, but it's driven entirely by the service sector. They didn't have a disadvantage in any sector, they just perform the same as capitalist firms outside of services. Co-ops may deliberately target industries where they are more likely to succeed, as one paper explains with reference to a number of worker co-ops in the USA.
Wages chose the green house cleaning industry because of its growing market, relatively high profit margin, low barriers to entry for low-income women, and health and environmental benefits. CHCA and ChildSpace chose industries, home, healthcare, and childcare, that employ a lot of people in low-quality jobs and where improving job quality would create a competitive advantage in the marketplace. Mondragon has chosen industries where existing co-ops could purchase a major portion of a new co-op's products or services.
Maybe the relatively small number of people who decide to run their organisations as worker co-ops are highly motivated and buy into the idea of worker ownership. They know the industries that will give them trouble and avoid them to ensure the success of the co-op. That such co-ops are more likely to succeed than conventional enterprises actually isn't surprising. It could have little bearing on what would happen if we, say, passed a law requiring all firms to be worker co-ops. Such a law may include industries which are less suited to co-ops and people and organisations who don't care for or understand the idea. Worker co-ops would surely be less likely to thrive if the organisational form had been forcibly imposed on all firms, which is why I don't advocate such a policy.
When are people going to learn? Democracy doesn't work!
Given that worker co-ops have not been proven to be generalisable, which issues are likely to surface as we try to expand the practice? One novel approach we could take is to ask them. A problem which repeatedly comes up in interviews with all types of cooperative is that they have trouble obtaining financing. Cooperatives in both Canada and the USA have identified this as a major problem, especially in the early years. The evidence isn't clear on whether worker co-ops in particular fare better or worse than consumer or supplier co-ops, but all seem to share characteristics which might deter external investment. Firstly, they are still a relatively rare and novel form of organisation which creditors may not be confident will return their investment. Secondly, co-ops have an explicit policy to centre the interests of their members rather than investors, whereas capitalist firms are explicitly investor-owned, so investor interests will of course take priority. As a result of the difficulty in obtaining external financing, many co-ops rely on member contributions. People have to pay thousands of dollars or the equivalent to join the co-op, and this money is used to build wealth and invest. Although this has been successful in places like France and Italy as we've seen, it has an obvious problem. If co-ops are set up in lower income communities, they may have trouble obtaining financing. But if they exclude these communities, then they're going to be a bit of a middle class thing, excluding the people who arguably need them most. The most obvious policy to help co-ops finance themselves would be direct grants and loans from local and national governments, as well as other financial incentives such as tax breaks, which as we saw play a big role in Uruguay. Not only could these be expanded, but the information about how to access them could be more widespread, as currently what's available isn't always taken up. One example is the underutilized Local Enterprise Assistance Fund, or LEAF, in the USA, which offers credit to co-ops but gets few applications, even fewer of which are credible. There are also a number of innovative ways people have got around the financing problem without direct state support. One option is to allow external shareholders who receive dividends but have partial or no voting rights, keeping the control in the hands of the workers. The successful US co-op Equal Exchange has provided these so-called Class B shareholders with annual dividends for more than 20 years. The Class A shareholders are the workers. In some cases, financial institutions are also established as part of a concerted effort by a community to establish a democratic economy. The Mondragon Corporation in Spain, which we'll discuss later, owes some of its success to an early decision to create its own bank. Credit unions, which if you remember are a type of consumer co-op, can help to finance worker co-ops and generally make things more co-op-y. This is one reason I don't think worker co-ops should be the sole form of organisation in an economy. Consumer co-ops, supplier co-ops, and worker co-ops can all coexist and indeed complement one another, as Logue Yates explain.
Aside from strikes, many 19th century workers' cooperatives were created to meet genuine social needs that made for business opportunities. For example, consumer cooperatives have sold goods competitively for over a century in the United Kingdom, lowering the cost of living for working families by returning a regular dividend to their member customers based on patronage. The consumer cooperatives encouraged the development of workers' cooperatives to supply them with goods. The cooperative model was also widely and successfully adapted to agriculture and to an environment in which farmers were accustomed to helping each other through catastrophes of every variety.
In summary, worker co-ops may have a number of benefits, but we have to be careful when generalising the evidence. Existing worker co-ops are likely to be a selected sample of highly motivated people who buy into the idea and operate in industries and locations where co-ops are more likely to succeed. If we are to expand the policy, we need to be aware of the weaknesses of worker co-ops and the challenges they will face. But despite these doubts, there is little evidence that worker democracy is an unviable form of enterprise. Policies which aim to extend community efforts, including funding, education, and raising awareness, can help to expand worker and other forms of co-ops pragmatically and from the ground up. We'll note these down as entry number 2 in our bag of policies. The good news is that there are also some benefits of worker democracy that are based on more reliable evidence, and we'll turn to these in the next section. The punchline of this evidence is that worker democracy is, wait for it, good for workers. When I was a teenager, I had a job in data entry at the office of Debenhams, a UK department store. 1 month in, I had a performance review, and at one point they asked me if I had any questions of my own. My only question was simple: what is my job? I knew the name of the company that it sold clothes and that I was entering data about them, but I didn't know why. This line of sight problem is where workers are disconnected from the fruits of their labour and lack an understanding of how the company fits together. Marx, of course, would have just called it alienation. Once I was informed that I was writing data for the Debenhams website, I naturally took a look at it. As a result, I understood much better how terrible the website was and how futile my efforts really were. That's probably why Debenhams is currently in liquidation. The line of sight problem means that workers may not understand the company, affecting their motivation and ability to contribute to the broader goals of the organization. It's the flip side of the problem in the undercover boss, where the people at the top have only a bird's eye view with little idea of how the company actually operates day to day. An area of research that speaks to the line of sight problem, though doesn't always call it that, is on employee stock ownership. These schemes entitle employees to shares in the company, which supplement their income through dividends or help them build wealth, often for retirement. In the UK, USA and Japan, stock ownership seems to be the most widespread. But these stock options may give workers ownership without giving them control. In some cases, they even entail what's called phantom stock, which doesn't give employees actual stock but ties their pay to the company's performance. Many studies have found that employee stock ownership by itself can boost the performance of a firm, increasing its productivity and survival rates slightly. But there's more to it than this simple finding. One study looked at firms in the USA, some of which use what the study's authors called shared capitalism, which includes stock options and other profit-sharing practices. The study finds that higher degrees of shared capitalism are associated with greater trust levels, information sharing, perceptions of fairness, and cooperation between workers themselves. The study also looks at the relationship of shared capitalism to harder outcomes like profitability and the likelihood employees will leave. Most interestingly, they investigate how these things are affected by the combination of ownership and participation, and this is important for the idea of worker democracy. There's quite a bit going on in this graph, so let's unpack it. On the y-axis, we have the outcome we are interested in, voluntary turnover, which is when employees leave the organization of their own volition. Ideally, we want this to be low, though perhaps not zero. On the x-axis, we have a measure of how empowered employees are, using the index of trust, participation, and information sharing constructed by the authors of the study. The brown or red or whatever color line that is shows the effect of employee empowerment on voluntary turnover for firms with no shared capitalism, with the dotted lines representing the bounds of uncertainty. The black line shows the same for firms with a high degree of shared capitalism. For the firms without shared capitalism, greater empowerment has no effect on workers' likelihood of leaving, as shown by the flatness of the brown-red line. Perhaps this is because workers do not value greater responsibilities without ownership. But for the firms with shared capitalism, greater empowerment is associated with lower voluntary turnover, as shown by the downward slope of the black line. In other words, under shared capitalism, people are less likely to leave when they are given a bigger role in the firm's decisions. It seems the combination of ownership through shared capitalism and of control through empowerment produces lower turnover rates than either one on their own. Merely owning stocks is not enough. You have to be able to take part in the running of the organization to make the ownership meaningful. The authors comment,
Our interpretation is that employees may react badly to shared capitalism when they are closely supervised and not given the tools to improve performance. We want you to be inspired by the shared rewards, but we're still going to keep a close eye on you. In this case, the shared capitalism may be seen primarily as shifting financial risk onto employees.
In addition, a measure of the firm's profitability, the return on equity, does not seem to be negatively affected by employee ownership and control. Other studies have found similar effects, though of course I've simplified the findings slightly. One question you might ask is, how does this study account for the selection bias we were worried about earlier? Well, that's a good question. After all, it could be that firms which are generally more labour-friendly are just more likely to have shared capitalism, and it's this labour-friendliness, rather than the shared capitalism itself, which is driving the lower quit rates of employees. If that's the case, this isn't great evidence in favour of worker democracy. Well, every firm in the shared capitalism study was from a list of the 100 best places to work in the USA, so it's fair to say that every firm in the study has labour-friendly policies and a happy, motivated workforce. It's instructive that even among the most labour-friendly companies in the country, worker democracy is associated with better outcomes. Expanding share ownership rights and combining them with participation rights may be a practical path to worker democracy, especially in countries like the USA, UK and Japan, where they are already more common and where ecosystems of worker co-ops like the ones in continental Europe are less prevalent. This was, in fact, the logic of former Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell's proposals in the UK for the 2019 election. We'll note this down as entry number 3 in our bag of policies. A second approach to account for selection bias is to look at individual workers who change their employment between different types of firms. One study in Uruguay looked at pay and measures of inequality between what the study calls capitalist firms and worker-managed firms. This graph shows the mean to median pay ratio for capitalist firms over time, depicted in grey, and worker-managed firms, depicted in black. If the mean is higher than the median, the average pay in the organisation is skewed upwards by those at the top, and doesn't reflect the pay of most workers. You can see that the ratio is above 1 for both types of organisation in every year, so those at the top are always paid more, even in worker-managed firms. However, the grey line is always substantially above the black line, so capitalist firms have a higher mean to median pay ratio, making them less equal than worker-managed firms. The panel data in this study also allows us to look at behaviour over time. This means that we can see what happens to an individual worker's pay when they change between the two types of firm. This is important because the worker is fixed, so any change in pay can't be explained by the fact that worker-managed and capitalist firms just employ different types of people. It seems that there is a slight pay boost on average for moving to a worker-managed firm, but workers at the bottom benefit while those at the top may even lose out. According to the study, the average worker will receive a pay rise in both absolute terms and relative to those at the top when they join a worker-managed firm. The flip side of this is that worker-managed firms may suffer from a brain drain as talented individuals leave to higher-paying firms, another challenge for worker democracy. A third and final approach to account for selection bias is to follow a given business and given set of workers over time to see how capitalist and worker-managed firms respond differently to changes in circumstances. What happens when there's a recession or just less demand for a particular firm's products? How does the organisation cope? Another Uruguayan study looked at how pay and employment respond for the different organisational forms. They find that when facing lower demand or recessions, worker co-ops are much less likely to fire employees, instead opting to reduce wages across the board. Co-ops therefore protect the employment of their members, while capitalist firms are happy to shed them to remain profitable.
And maybe a deal has a point about the machinery of capitalism being oiled with the blood of the workers.
The authors of the study note that these results are similar to studies in Italy and in the USA. Volatile pay may also help to explain the inconsistent evidence on whether workers are paid more in worker-managed firms, which we mentioned earlier. Since pay at worker-managed firms varies so much more than at conventional firms, it really depends on when and where you take the sample. In a recession, worker-managed firms may pay less. In a boom, they may pay more. Pay will also vary across industries depending on the conditions they're facing at the time. In summary, we have looked at more rigorous evidence to establish the benefits of worker democracy for workers. Number 1. Among US firms which are already considered great places to work, firms with a combination of shared capitalism and worker empowerment retain workers more and have at least as high profitability. Number 2. Workers who move to cooperative firms from capitalist firms in Uruguay benefit from greater pay at the bottom, both in absolute terms and relative to those at the top. Number 3. In Italy, Uruguay and the USA, worker-managed firms respond to downturns by cutting pay instead of employment, retaining their workers. I want to stress again that even this evidence isn't perfect, but it's a lot better than many of the studies from our earlier summary of the literature. Given that worker democracy seems to have numerous benefits, one question remains. Is it a sustainable type of organisation? Can it continue to exist over the long term? Or will worker democracy ultimately succumb to the pressures of competition and scale? We now turn to how to maintain worker democracy in the context of a capitalist economy. Worker democracy faces many challenges, especially as organisations grow into corporations and are forced to compete on international markets. Without proper channels from workers to the top of the corporation, the firms may become worker democratic in name only, as the democratic mechanisms which worked before are no longer effective. Share ownership and participation, which we discussed in the previous section, is one way of empowering workers in such a setting. but it may not be enough if workers do not have influence at the corporate level. In this part of the video, we're going to investigate two main cases. Firstly, the Mondragon Corporation in the Basque region of Spain. Secondly, the case of worker representation on corporate boards that is common in parts of Northern and Central Europe. Both of these examples of worker democracy have serious issues in my opinion, but they hopefully highlight how we can hope to do things better. To start with the first one, Mondragon has long been held up as a shining example of worker democracy at scale. It grew from one co-op with 5 workers in 1956 to around 100 co-ops with 80,000 workers today. It stretches across a number of businesses including finance, manufacturing, retail, and knowledge, whatever that means. Earlier I spoke about the dangers of generalizing the benefits of worker co-ops from the selected sample of people employed by them. In his evaluation of Mondragon, Anders Asa Christiansen echoes these concerns.
Given its beginnings, the conception of democracy in Mondragon has depended on a homogeneous group pursuing an agreed upon common good. As Mondragon grew in size, it also grew in diversity. Members were no longer self-selecting adherents of cooperativism, and production required greater division of labour. Today, with a membership of over 80,000, a conception of democracy based on the common good cannot accommodate the diversity of interests that are found in Mondragon. There are many conflicting views between members of different cooperatives, between workers and management within each respective group.
Christiansen argues that Mondragon's problems may stem from its attachment to a type of democracy based on participation and consensus, which only really works at the level of an individual co-op. According to this argument, democracy is most effective when relatively small groups of people are striving towards a common goal and can easily discuss and control the strategy of the co-op. This just isn't possible in a corporate environment with tens of thousands of workers whose interests, values, and knowledge all diverge. The current system at Mondragon deals with this by having the individual worker co-ops elect representatives who form a congress and in turn elect a governing body which itself elects a president. There are clearly several layers of hierarchy separating the workers from the governing body, who are only accountable to the Congress of elected representatives rather than to the workers directly. Members have complained that they are not listened to, and in one case fewer workers said that they felt they were part of the firm than those at a comparable private company. It seems that the worker democratic model has come under strain owing to the pressures of international competition, the challenges of scale, and poor policy choices. For example, one of Mondragon's long-standing boasts was that it never laid off workers. Instead, they would relocate unproductive members of one cooperative elsewhere or reduce pay during hard times, in line with the studies we saw earlier. However, over the past few decades, Mondragon has seen a steady growth of contract workers who do not count as members of the organisation and therefore do not have democratic voting rights. In 1997, members were 56% of the workforce. By 2007, that number was 29%. After the global financial crisis in 2008, no members lost their jobs, but thousands of non-members did. As a result, members have gone up to 40% of the workforce simply because so many non-members were jettisoned from the organisation entirely, rather than because membership has actually been expanded. In a move that seems strange on its face, Mondragon has also opposed strikes and collective bargaining agreements from unions, sometimes banning them as a condition of joining. On paper, you wouldn't expect that from an organisation that is worker-owned and run. At most, you'd guess unions would become irrelevant, but they're being actively suppressed. There have also been work to rule strikes at Mondragon over the past few decades, a sure sign that the institution has become rigid and unresponsive to the workers. It could be argued that having non-members is a necessary consequence of expansion, as you have to cut costs and compete. But in Uruguay, which if you remember requires 5 out of 6 employees to be members by law, no such degeneration into conventional forms of employment has been observed. So perhaps some of these anti-labour practices are just bad policy choices rather than absolute necessities. Despite its problems, Mondragon still has a number of things to boast about. The majority of workers, members or otherwise, say they would rather work there than for a non-democratic organisation. As of 2014, the ratio of the highest to the lowest salary in Mondragon is about 20:1. This is a sizable ratio and far from its original ratio of 3:1, but it is still much lower than the average Spanish ratio of CEO to worker pay, which is 143:1. In any case, Mondragon needs to evolve. As Christensen points out, Mondragon's elections are not really competitive, since there is no party competition at each cooperative, a system Christensen likens to elections in China. Representatives do not bring radically different approaches or compete to attract workers, and changing this would help to make democracy more than just a fig leaf. Party competition for representatives is one idea for maintaining worker democracy at the corporate level, though it makes more sense in organisations that are already co-ops and therefore have elections at the level of the individual firm. Our second example is electing worker representatives directly to corporate boards, which can apply to all types of firms, including conventional ones. Board representation is often thought of as a compromise between the demands of competition and the interests of workers. Better integrating worker knowledge into the running of firms by having them on boards has long been a feature of many European social democracies. I've repeatedly stressed that the existing evidence on worker democracy isn't quite where we'd like it to be. There are few studies that manage to do away with all the messy confounders we've been worried about throughout this video. Early evidence on board representation suffered from a similar problem. However, unlike the results we've seen for worker co-ops, the literature was unable to reach a consensus, with different studies finding different effects of the practice on productivity and profitability. Two recent papers give us much more definitive evidence on the effects of worker board representation. One investigates the policy in Germany, where they partially abolished board representation. The other investigates it in Finland, where they introduced the policy. As we mentioned at the start of this video, your typical capitalist firm, shown on the right, has the shareholders elect a board who hire and supervise executives who in turn manage the workers. In the German variant, shown on the left, the workers elect a minority of the top-level board along with the shareholders. Germany has a reputation as being quite labour-friendly, and this policy, along with stronger unions and a bigger welfare state, is considered a major part of that. A paper by Jaeger et al. Uses a law change created as a last-minute compromise between different political parties. This meant that smaller firms created after the 10th of August 1994 were no longer required to have worker representatives. The number of workers on boards therefore dropped substantially compared to the older firms, which had to retain the policy. By comparing the older firms to the newer firms, the study found that worker representation did not seem to increase workers' wages, while it slightly increased the level of investment. Similar results were obtained in the study in Finland, where the policy of worker representation was introduced rather than partially abolished. Again, the effects of this on the outcomes we are interested in were small. Worker representation in Finland created a minor reduction in redundancy and firing and an increase in subjective job quality as judged by the workers. There were small increases in capital investment, firm survival, and productivity. Why are the effects from both Germany and Finland so small or even non-existent? The answer is simple. Minority worker representation is not a policy with much bite. In the Finland study, they included interviews with worker representatives who were clear about this.
Management has, in fact, already decided the course of action at the stage when I become aware of it. At that point, it is virtually impossible to influence the big lines anymore. Maybe you can say your words and negotiate on some details.
I have a feeling that I cannot influence the company's decisions. Things cannot be influenced before decisions are made. They are only information about decisions already made.
Historically, social democratic parties in Germany actually opposed minority board representation as giving too much away to the interests of capital. Knowledge sharing and worker-friendly policies are already features of both countries. Perhaps board representation is a reflection of a political environment with more cooperation between labour and capital, rather than a policy which has drastically shifted the relationship in favour of labour. Recall my original reasons for advocating worker democracy. 1. Workers can harness their collective knowledge to make the running of the firm more effective. 2. Workers can use their political power to make sure the organisation is run with their interests at heart. It seems that minority board representation only manages the first of these at best, and it illustrates the limits of worker participation without sufficient worker power. Going back to the undercover boss, the show culminates in them changing policies and gifting individuals they met during their time as a worker. The idea is that because of their exposure to the workers, the boss will now implement better policies, not unlike the rationale of minority board representation of workers. Television is television, but I'm always struck by how stingy and individualistic the bosses end up being with their gifts. They tend to shy away from structural changes, preferring to give the workers they met a holiday, while the broader solutions they do offer are limited at best.
It is tough to do this job with back pain. You'll see a lot of people hobbling around on the ramp, whether they've got busted knees or busted backs, but, you know, you just keep on trudging.
What I'm going to do is arrange for a physiotherapist to be at the hub twice a week to begin with.
Wow.
We'll see what the demand is like.
So guys would really appreciate that.
Will I?
Hey dickhead, why don't you reduce the amount each worker is expected to deliver in a given time? Maybe by hiring more workers? You know, stop the back pain from occurring in the first place, instead of slapping a plaster on what is a chronic and debilitating condition. One more, which is my favourite, as this is the only thing the boss gives this woman, who he clearly doesn't like.
It's pretty clear to me that you need a team of people that will break the rules that you are currently constrained by. What I'm going to propose is that I send you off to the reputedly land of customer service excellence. You go across to Phoenix, Arizona, where our call centre is there, for a few days. Bring back some ideas.
That's really nice.
Alright, I think this guy was particularly stingy even by the standards of the show. In summary, workers need proper political power. Just knowledge sharing and exposing bosses to their plight is not enough. Representation of workers on corporate boards is certainly fine and doesn't seem to produce negative consequences, but it should be boosted to majority representation to have more of an impact. Ironically, Mondragon could probably use this policy too, but then they'd have to stop suppressing workers. We'll note majority board representation down as entry number 4 in our bag of policies. I'd also be willing to accept minority representation as a stepping stone in countries that currently have none. Throughout this video, I've put 4 types of policy into the policy bag for expanding worker democracy realistically and pragmatically. Number 1, expansion of funding and law changes to encourage the formation of worker co-ops, learning from successful examples such as those in France, Italy, and Uruguay. Number 2, expansion of community-led efforts which include and encourage worker co-ops, as well as complementary organisations like credit unions through funding, education, and awareness. Number 3, expansion of share options in firms in combination with participation, especially in countries which already use share-based policies more, like the UK, US, and Japan. Finally, majority worker representation on corporate boards, especially in countries which already have minority representation like Germany and Finland. I've been over some of the benefits and especially the lack of clear drawbacks of worker democracy, as well as some of the holes in our knowledge and the challenges it faces. It seems clear to me that worker democracy can grant voice, employment stability, and greater pay equality to workers. There are definitely challenges, and worker democracy will struggle more in some industries than others, which is why its expansion should be gradual and accompanied by numerous forms of support, both from the state and from communities. However, there is a much more powerful critique of worker democracy out there, not as a bad idea in itself, but as a policy which is insufficient to achieve a good standard of living for the population. Simply put, if you're not a worker, then worker democracy won't do much for you. And approximately half of all people are not workers. Children, the retired, the sick and disabled, carers and homemakers, and the unemployed will not benefit directly from firms being worker-owned and run, since those firms have no natural obligation to help them. These groups therefore need to be supported by other means, most notably welfare. Another reason worker co-ops do not eliminate the need for redistribution is that although they reduce inequality within firms, they cannot do so between firms. Inequalities between firms can be huge, leading to pay disparities just as high or higher than the ones we've seen between CEO and worker. This remains true even if all firms are worker-owned and managed. Inequality across industries and regions was a key feature of the market socialist Yugoslavian economy, for example. Worker democracy therefore needs to be combined with redistribution to reduce inequality, plus free stuff to ensure a good standard of living for non-workers, which I just might have to make another video about one day. There are plenty more problems that worker democracy will not solve on its own, like environmental degradation or bigotry. There is no reason to believe that if Shell were worker-owned, it would be any more environmentally friendly. If a worker co-op were established in a time and place where people were sexist and racist, then the co-op would itself be sexist and racist, possibly even exacerbated by strong in-group tendencies. Worker democracy is just one piece of the puzzle. With all this said, there is plenty of room for enthusiasm and optimism. Worker democracy is currently operating in an environment which may be inhospitable to it. Mondragon, for example, suffers from competing on the international market with corporations which are not democratically governed and so which may compete more ruthlessly on cost, especially labour costs. Spanish law has also changed in recent decades to be more favourable to conventional limited liability companies, which illustrates the importance of legal context. As mentioned earlier, worker co-ops in Uruguay suffer from a brain drain as well-paid workers leave to better-paying capitalist firms. Yet, as worker co-ops and other forms of co-op expand, things may well get easier for new ones as they do not suffer from as much competition with capitalist firms. Existing co-ops may lead by example. Canadian studies generally report that help from existing cooperative organisations was vital in helping them establish themselves. The peak of this is in Italy, where, as we saw, co-ops help fund social services. I've repeatedly emphasised that co-ops are a selected sample, and the fact that people in worker co-ops may be different to those in conventional firms, but, to repeat a cliché, people can change. One study found that people in all types of co-ops, that's consumer, supplier, worker and more, report that their work has made them trust others more. I'm cautiously optimistic that exposing workers to a different institutional environment will create a workforce and economy that is more cooperative and less competitive. Worker democracy is not going to solve every problem we have, and the path to establishing it as a norm will be slow and uncertain. But there are plenty of reasons to be for it, and despite some challenges, few clear reasons to be against it. People should have a degree of control over and participation in their lives. Those with power, whether in government or in private organisations, should be elected and accountable to the people they have power over. This is a basic principle of democracy, and really all we're talking about is extending this to the economic sphere. It will bring benefits to workers with no insurmountable issues for firms and the economy as a whole. Based on the existing evidence, my conclusion is that worker democracy is definitely worth a try. Thanks for listening to this video on worker democracy, everybody. I hope I made an honest assessment of the evidence. I think that almost every study I've seen points to some benefits or certainly no drawbacks of it. So there was basically no reason I could see from what I read that worker democracy wouldn't work out in practice. But, you know, I'd be happy to see if there's any more literature, anything that I've missed. If you think there is, then let me know in the comments. Anyway, thanks to my patrons, my long-suffering patrons who are very patient with me as I put together these obscenely long videos. And, you know, please sign up to Patreon. I am thinking about moving to this full-time if I can get enough money on Patreon to sustain myself. And don't forget to like and subscribe, follow me on Twitter, all of that stuff. Thanks so much to Friberg, who was patient and understanding throughout the editing process, and whose name I've definitely pronounced wrong. But if you've watched my videos before, you're probably used to me pronouncing names wrong. Anyway, I'll see you next time for a video which will actually be much shorter, for sure, and also a little bit different.
Any shout out for your loyal producer?
Oh, yeah, of course. Can't believe I forgot that. Okay. Thanks so much to my loyal producer, Hobbie. Sorry, can't do it. He's told me to do it. He asked me to do it just now. I can't do it.
Loyal and charming.
Loyal, charming, handsome.
Yes,
yeah, talented.
Thanks, buddy.
Bye.
Bye.